Protracted the conflict had certainly been, and sanguinary too, 3 days of fighting having produced a combined total of about 50,000 casualties north and south. Nor was it quite over yet. Although Lee could not, and Meade would not renew the infantry action, two indecisive and, as it were, extraneous cavalry engagements, one 3 miles east of Gettysburg, deep in the Federal right rear, and the other just west of Round Top on the Confederate right flank, were respectively still to be ended and begun. The former, which reached a climax at about the time Pickett and Pettigrew surged up Cemetery Ridge, was a result of Jeb Stuart's attempt to carry out his instructions for placing his troopers in a position from which to harry the expected, or at any rate hoped for, blue retreat. Whereas the latter, fought about an hour after the gray attackers fell back across the valley, was a result of Judson Kilpatrick's attempt, in the absence of instructions, to strike while the tactical iron was hot, and thus not only throw the rebels into retreat, but also provoke a panic that would prevent them from achieving a getaway. Neither Stuart nor Kilpatrick, quite different in makeup and ability, but altogether similar in their thirst for action and applause, succeeded in accomplishing what he set out to do. In fact, as the two things turned out, both generals would have done better to remain within their respective lines, together with all their men, especially Kilpatrick. At midday, Stuart rode eastward out the York Pike with the brigades of Chambliss and Jenkins, the latter now under M.J. Ferguson, since its regular commander had been wounded the day before. Hampton and Fitz Lee followed at a distance, bringing the total to just over 6,000 sabres. One night's rest could scarcely have restored either the men or their mounts after a week on the go, but Jeb was eager for a fight. On Evelington Heights, a year ago this morning, by way of providing the just-concluded drama of the 7 days with an upbeat epilogue, he had opened fire with a single howitzer on McClellan's blue host encamped at Harrison's Landing. And though he'd been criticized for flushing the game in this fashion, he would have liked nothing better today than another such opportunity, especially after the chilling reception his chief had given him yesterday when he rejoined the army that had been groping blindfold in his absence. For more than 2 miles, however, he did not sight a single enemy soldier. The Pennsylvania countryside looked altogether peaceful, its rolling farmlands untouched by war, despite the thunder of the great cannonade behind him south of Gettysburg, which began soon after 1 o'clock and continued to rumble without diminution as he turned south about 2:30 along Cress Ridge, which extended down to the Hanover Road and the Baltimore Pike beyond. Presently he spotted horsemen a mile to the east on the Low Dutch Road, a lane that paralleled the ridge, and promptly decided to defeat or drive them off, thus clearing his path to the Union rear. Accordingly, after posting Chambliss behind a screen of woods, he dismounted Ferguson's men and sent them forward to take position around a large barn on the farm of a family named Rummel. They would serve as bait to draw the Federals, whose strength was so far undisclosed, after which Stuart planned to attack with Chambliss, then sweep the field with Hampton and Lee, whom he warned by courier to remain under cover of the ridge as they came up, thereby adding the shock of surprise to the weight of their horseback assault on the unsuspecting bluecoats, whose attention would be fixed on the dismounted and presumably vulnerable band of graybacks in the Rummel barnyard. It did not work out quite that way for several reasons. For one, the Blue Riders were in much greater numbers than he knew. 2 brigades of David Gregg's division, reinforced by 1 brigade from Kilpatrick's, were at hand, 5,000 strong, armed with repeating carbines and apparently as eager for a clash as Stuart was. This by itself would have been all right. The Confederates still had the numerical advantage, but it presently developed that Ferguson's men, through a misinterpretation of instructions, had drawn only 10 rounds of ammunition each, with the result that they ran out of bullets almost as soon as the fight got started. Stuart had to send in Chambliss prematurely in order to keep the bait from being gobbled before he was set to spring the trap. Even this was not too bad, or anyhow it need not have been, if Hampton and Lee had come up as planned, but they did not. Disclosing their presence while still too far away to achieve surprise, they gave the Federals time to fall back from the melee around the barn and form their ranks to receive the charge. In fact, a good many of the Bluecoats did a great deal more than that. They moved to meet it. The brigade attached from Kilpatrick included 4 Michigan regiments commanded by a recently promoted brigadier named George A. Custer, bottom man in the West Point class of '61, which had lost its top man yesterday on Little Round Top. Custer, whose love of combat was only exceeded by his ache for glory, saw the rebel column approaching and moved fast. "Come on, you Wolverines," he shouted, 4 lengths in front of the lead regiment, his long yellow ringlet streaming in the wind. A Federal witness described what followed. As the 2 columns approached each other, the pace of each increased when suddenly a crash, like the falling of timber, betokened the crisis. So sudden and violent was the collision that many of the horses were turned end over end and crushed their riders beneath them. The clashing of sabers, the firing of pistols, the demands for surrender and cries of the combatants now filled the air. Gregg dealt ably with the situation that developed, sending in other units to strike the flanks of the gray column which Custer had brought to a standstill by meeting it head-on. And while the saber-to-saber conflict was in progress, cannoneers on both sides threw in shell and canister whenever they could do so without too great risk of hitting their own men. Hampton went down with a deep gash in his head, but was brought off the field in time to prevent his capture. Stewart, perhaps reasoning that it was not after all his mission to stage a cavalry fight at this stage of the battle, which he had no way of knowing was now at its climax back on Cemetery Ridge, with Armistead crying, "Follow me," as he stepped over the low stone wall along Meade's center, withdrew his troopers to the ridge from which they'd charged, and Gregg, who had cause to be well satisfied, was content to let them go. The artillery exchange continued till past sundown, at which time the Confederates retired northward and went unmolested into bivouac alongside the York Pike, near the point where they had left it 6 hours back. Gregg reported 254 casualties, most of them Custer's, whose Michiganders would suffer before the war was over a larger number of killed and wounded than any other cavalry brigade in the Union Army. Stewart listed 181, but since this was exclusive of Ferguson's brigade and the artillery, the losses probably were about equal on both sides. Jeb made the most of the affair in his report, praising the conduct of some of his regiments by saying that the enemy's masses vanished before them like grain before the scythe. Yet the fact remained that for once he'd failed to drive an outnumbered foe from a fair field of fight. Defeated at every point, the enemy withdrew, Gregg declared, and while Stewart objected strenuously to the claim, he'd withdrawn when he got good and ready, he maintained. There could be no denying that he'd failed in his purpose of reaching the Union rear, even though it later developed that there was no retreat for him to harry, and therefore no real work for him to do if he had been there. 4 miles southwest of the Rummel farm, the other cavalry action was over too by now. Beginning some 2 hours later, it ended some 2 hours earlier, and if, despite this brevity, its potential fruits were greater, the intention had been to throw Lee's right into confusion hard on the heels of the picket Pettigrew repulse, and thus set him up for a crumpling assault to be launched by the Blue Infantry from the western slopes of the Round Tops. So too was the failure, which amounted to nothing more or less than a fiasco. Kilpatrick's remaining brigade, commanded by 26-year-old Elon J. Farnsworth, was in position on the rebel flank, opposed by a skirmish line of Texans from Law's division, which extended from the base of Round Top west to the Emmitsburg Road. A year older than Farnsworth and 4 years older than Custer, who had been a West Point classmate, Kilpatrick rode back and forth among his troopers, expressing what one of them called great impatience and eagerness for orders. There was nothing unusual in this, for that was his accustomed manner all the way back to his boyhood in New Jersey. A wiry, restless, undersized man with black eyes and a lantern jaw, as a fellow officer described him. He had stringy blonde side whiskers, bandy legs that gave him a rolling gait, and a burning ambition which he attempted to assuage and advance with constant aggressiveness and bluster. The result was not uncomical, at least to some observers. Sherman, for one, was to call him a hell of a damn fool, and a member of Meade's staff remarked that it was hard to look at Kilpatrick without laughing. But this last was not always the case for those who served under him. Kill cavalry, they dubbed him somewhat ruefully, and it was especially not the case today so far as Farnsworth was concerned. For Kilpatrick kept insisting that he make horseback probes at the rebel skirmish line, despite the boulder-strewn terrain, which was highly unsuitable for cavalry operations. And the renowned marksmanship of the Texans, who had emptied a good many saddles by now and were backed up, moreover, by Law's old brigade of Alabamians, whose skill was scarcely less in that respect. However, the worst was still to come for Farnsworth and his men. It came shortly before 5 o'clock when an orderly arrived on a lathered horse from Cemetery Ridge, shouting as he drew near, "We turned the charge, 9 acres of prisoners." That was enough for Kilpatrick. Though he had no instructions to go over to the offensive, he assumed that Meade was on the lookout for a chance to strike at the rebel line, especially if some part of it could be thrown into confusion beforehand, and he quickly determined to provide such an opportunity for the forces gazing down from the slopes of Round Top. Turning to Farnsworth, he told him to commit a West Virginia regiment at once, with orders to hack a gap in the butternut skirmish line, then go for the Confederate main body, deployed along the base of the height beyond Plum Run, opposing the blue infantry above. The West Virginians tried it and were repulsed, losing heavily when the Texans rose from behind a rail fence and slammed mass volleys at them. They tried it again, and again by way of demonstration that the terrain was unsuited to horseback maneuver, were driven back. Kilpatrick was not satisfied. Having often maintained that cavalry could fight anywhere except at sea, he was out to prove it here today. He told Farnsworth to send in a second regiment, this time one of Vermonters, who had suffered cruelly in the earlier skirmishing. Farnsworth had shown his mettle in some 40 engagements since the first days of the war, and only 4 days ago he'd been promoted from captain to brigadier in recognition of his bravery under fire. There could scarcely be any question of his courage, but after what they'd both just seen, he could not believe he'd heard his chief aright. "General, do you mean it?" he asked. "Shall I throw my handful of men over rough ground through timber against a brigade of infantry? The 1st Vermont has already been fought half to pieces. These are too good men to kill." But Kilpatrick not only meant it, he wanted it done without question or delay. "Do you refuse to obey my orders?" he snapped. "If you're afraid to lead this charge, I will lead it." Farnsworth rose in his stirrups, flushed with anger. "Take that back," he cried, and an observer thought the tall young man looked magnificent in his passion. Kilpatrick bristled back at him for a moment, but then repented and apologized. "I didn't mean it. Forget it," he said. Farnsworth's anger subsided as quickly as it had risen. "General, if you order the charge, I will lead it," he replied, "but you must take the responsibility." Kilpatrick nodded. "I take the responsibility," he said. The Texans were even readier now than they had been before. Posted within earshot, they had overheard the hot exchange between the two young brigadiers, with the result that they not only had time to brace themselves for what was coming, but also time to pass the word along to Law that his rear would be threatened if the troopers managed to punch a hole in the widespread skirmish line. The Vermonters were prepared to do just that, though one of them later wrote, "Each man felt as he tightened his saber belt that he was summoned to a ride to death." Farnsworth having massed them in depth, they broke through on a narrow front about midway of the line, taking losses along both flanks as they made their penetration, then swung hard east to strike the rear of the rebel infantry on the far side of Plum Run, which was bone dry at this season. They crossed, still at a gallop, but it would have been far better for them if they had not. As they approached what they thought was the Confederate rear, their drawn sabers flashing sunlight, it was as if the head of the column struck a tripwire. Oates, forewarned, had faced his Alabamians about, ignoring the enemy infantry uphill, and presented a solid front to the Blue Riders. The survivors turned sharply north again in an attempt to avoid a second volley, but that too was a mistake, since it carried them directly along the line of marksmen who did not neglect the rare opportunity for point-blank firing at cavalry in profile. For some, indeed, it was like a return to happier days. A company commander, seeing a horse collapse in mid-stride with a bullet through the brain, heard a private alongside him shout, "Captain, I shot that black." Asked why he had not aimed for the rider instead of the horse, the Alabamian grinned. "Oh, we'll get him anyhow," he said, "but I'm a hunter, and for 2 years I haven't looked at a deer's eye. I couldn't stand it." By that time, Law had reinforced the skirmishers with another regiment, so that when the blue survivors turned back west and south, they found the entry gap resealed. What had been intended as a havoc-spreading charge now degenerated into a sort of circus, Roman style, with the penned-in horsemen riding frantically in large circles, ricocheting from cluster to cluster of whooping rebels as they tried to find a way out of the fire-laced Coliseum. Farnsworth had his mount shot from under him, took another from a trooper who was glad to go afoot, and in final desperation, perhaps with Kilpatrick's taunt still ringing in his ears, made a suicidal one-man charge, saber raised, against a solid mass of Confederates who brought him down with 5 mortal wounds. Some 65 of his men had fallen with him by the time the remnant found an exit and regained the safety of the Union lines. No earthly good had been accomplished, except by way of providing a show for the spectators, blue and gray, who had watched as in an amphitheater. Still, Kilpatrick did not regret having ordered the attempt. He only regretted that the infantry onlookers high on the slopes of Round Top had failed to seize the advantage offered them by the Vermonters on the plain below, in which case, he reported, a total rout would have ensued. As for Farnsworth, for the honor of his young brigade and the glory of his corps, he gave his life. We can say of him in the language of another, "Good soldier, faithful friend, great heart, hail and farewell." Thus Kilpatrick, who had sent him to his death with words of doubt as to his courage. The infantry had not come down to join the mix-up in the valley for the sufficient reason that it had received no instructions to do so, although there were those who urged this course on Meade in no uncertain terms. One such was Pleasanton, who was quite as cocky as his lieutenants. "I'll give you half an hour to show yourself a great general," he told his chief, soon after the latter's arrival on Cemetery Ridge. "Order the army to advance while I take the cavalry and get in Lee's rear, and we'll finish the campaign in a week." But Meade was having no part of such advice. 6 days in command, he'd spent the last 3 locked in mortal combat, all of it defensive on his side, and he had no intention of shifting to the offensive on short notice, even if that had been possible, simply because another in the sequence of all-out rebel assaults on his fishhook line had been repulsed. Besides, he was by no means convinced that this was the last of them. "How do you know Lee'll not attack me again?" he replied. "We've done well enough." Pleasanton continued to press the point, maintaining that the Confederates, low on supplies by now and far from base, would be obliged to surrender if nailed down. To which Meade's only response was an invitation for the cavalrymen to accompany him on the triumphal ride along the ridge to Little Round Top. It seemed to Pleasanton that the cheers of the troops plainly showed they expected the advance, but the Army commander did not swerve from the opinion he had just expressed. "We have done well enough." Hancock made a similar appeal with similar results. Lifted into an ambulance after the charge had been repulsed, he ordered the vehicle halted as soon as it reached the Tawnytown Road, where shells from long-range Whitworths north of Gettysburg were still landing, and began to dictate a message to be delivered at once to Meade. After explaining that he had been severely, but I trust not seriously, wounded, he made it clear that he had not left his troops so long as a rebel was to be seen upright. Interrupted by the attending surgeon, who protested against the delay, especially on the enfilading fire from the rebels, the wounded general replied testily, "We've enfiladed them, goddamn 'em," and went on with his dictation. He urged his chief to hurl Sedgwick and Sykes at Seminary Ridge without delay, if indeed this had not been done already. "If the 6th and 5th Corps have pressed up, the enemy will be destroyed," he predicted, and he added, by way of reinforcing his claim that Lee was in no condition to withstand a determined attack, "The enemy must be short of ammunition, as I was shot with a 10-penny nail." However, All he heard from Meade was a verbal message that avoided the central issue altogether. "Say to General Hancock," his fellow Pennsylvanian replied, "that I regret exceedingly that he is wounded, and that I thank him for the country and for myself for the service he has rendered today." By this time, McLaws had begun the withdrawal Longstreet ordered, and when the Federal skirmishers followed the Graybacks out to the Emmitsburg Road, reclaiming the salient lost the day before, they were met by heavy volleys from guns and rifles, which tended to confirm the wisdom of Meade's decision, as he afterwards explained, not to advance on Seminary Ridge in consequence of the bad example Lee had set for me in ruining himself attacking a strong position. Nor was the Northern commander alone in this belief. Henry Hunt, who had been pulled from under his toppled horse at the climax of the rebel assault and suffered only minor aches and pains from the injuries received, sided absolutely with his chief. A prompt countercharge after combat between two small bodies of men is one thing, the artillerist later wrote. The change from the defensive to the offensive of an army after an engagement at a single point is quite another. To have made such a change to the offensive on the assumption that Lee had made no provision against the reverse would have been rash in the extreme. Warren thought so too. It was generally felt, he subsequently declared, that we'd saved the country for the time and that we had done enough, that we might jeopardize all that we had done by trying to do too much. Such were the opinions of the two surviving members of the quartet of generals, the dead Reynolds and the wounded Hancock with the other pair, who were commonly given credit then and later for having done most to prevent another defeat from being added to the Union record. A defeat, moreover, which, given the time and place, some would maintain the Union could not have survived. In point of fact, the greatest deterrent was the mute but staggering testimony of the casualty list, including Reynolds, Sickles, and Hancock, the three most aggressive of its corps commanders. A solid fourth of the Federal Army had been killed or wounded or captured, and well over half again as many skulkers and stragglers had simply wandered off or been knocked loose from their units. A head count next morning would show 51,414 present of all ranks. Of the more than 38,000 men who thus were absent, the actual casualties numbered 23,049. Precisely tabulated a few days later at 3,155 killed, 14,529 wounded, 5,365 captured, which left some 15,000 not accounted for, just now at least, and encouraged the belief that the losses had been even greater than they were in fact. Moreover, they were quite unevenly distributed. Of Meade's 7 infantry corps, the 4 led into action by Reynolds, Hancock, Sickles, and Howard had suffered almost 90% of the casualties. And if this had its brighter aspect, Sedgwick's corps, the largest in the Army, had scarcely been engaged at all and might therefore be considered available for delivery of the counterstroke urged by Pleasanton and Hancock. It also cast a corresponding gloom over those who had done the bleeding. All in all, when they became available, these figures did much to support the judgment of the responsible commander that, notwithstanding the tactical desirability of launching an immediate mass assault, which was as clear to him as it was to any man on the field, the troops were in no condition to sustain it. On the other hand, there was testimony from Lee's own ranks that the Confederates were in no condition to resist an assault if one had been made against them. Our ammunition was so low, Alexander confessed, and our diminished forces at the moment so widely dispersed along the unwisely extended line, that an advance by a single fresh corps, Sedgwick's for instance, could have cut us in two. Few on that same side of the line agreed with this, however. After all, it was not Lee's army that had been shattered in the desperate charge that afternoon, but only 8 of his 37 brigades, 5 of which, Anderson's other 3 and Pender's 2, the same number that had stood fast for Meade across the way, were on hand to defend his center. Moreover, all his cavalry was up by now, including M. Bowden's 2,000 troopers who had arrived at midday, and not one piece of artillery had been lost. Far from being depressed by the repulse, many along the rebel line had been angered by what they had seen and were eager for revenge. They asked for nothing better than a chance to serve the Bluecoats in the same manner if they could be persuaded to attack. "We'll fight them, sir, till hell freezes over," one grayback told an observer, "and then, sir, we will fight them on the ice." Indeed, adversity seemed to knit them closer together as a family, which was what they had become in the past year under Lee, and brought out the high qualities that would stand them in good stead during the downhill months ahead. Longstreet, for example, riding out after dark to inspect his skirmish line, found a battery still in position near the peach orchard, although he had ordered all his artillery withdrawn to the cover of the western ridge some time before. "Whose are these guns?" he demanded, whereupon a tall man with a pipe in his mouth stepped out of the shadows. "I am the captain," he said quietly. And when the general asked why he'd stayed out there in front of the infantry, the artilleryman replied, "I am out here to have a little skirmishing on my own account if the Yanks come out of their holes." Amused by the prospect of a skirmish with 12-pounder howitzers, and heartened by such evidence of staunchness in a time of strain, old Peter threw back his head and let his laugh ring out once more across that somber field. Incongruous as his laughter had seemed that afternoon, just before the 11,000-man assault wave broke and began to ebb, it sounded even stranger now in the darkness, under cover of which the extent of the Army's losses could begin to be assessed. From the top down, they were unremittingly grievous. Of the 52 Confederate generals who had crossed the Potomac in the past 3 weeks, no less than 17, barely under one-third, had become casualties in the past 3 days. 5 were killed outright or mortally wounded: Semmes and Barksdale, Pender, Armistead, and Garnett. 2 were captured: Archer, who'd been taken on the first day, and Trimble, who had not been able to make it back across the valley today with a shattered leg. And this figure would be increased to 3 when the Army began its withdrawal, since Kemper was too badly injured to be moved. 9 more were wounded, some lightly, such as Heath and Pettigrew, others gravely, such as Hood, whose arm might have to be taken off, and Hampton, who had received not 1 but 2 head cuts and also had some shrapnel in his body. When the list was lengthened by 18 colonels killed or captured, many of them officers of high promise, slated for early promotion, it was obvious that the Army of Northern Virginia had suffered a loss in leadership from which it might never recover. A British observer was of this opinion. He lauded the offensive prowess of Lee's soldiers, who had marched out as proudly as if on parade in their eagerness to come to grips with their opponents on the ridge across the way. But they will never do it again, he predicted, and he told why. He had been with the Army since Fredericksburg, ticking off the illustrious dead from Stonewall Jackson down, and now on the heels of Gettysburg, he asked a rhetorical question of his Confederate friends. "Don't you see your system feeds upon itself? You cannot fill the places of these men. Your troops do wonders, but every time at a cost you cannot afford." That might well be. Certainly there was no comfort in a comparison of the representation on the list of those of less exalted rank. Here, too, no less than a third had fallen, and possibly more, for the count was incomplete. Lee recorded his losses as 2,592 killed, 12,709 wounded, and 5,150 captured or missing, a total of 20,451, which was surely low for a variety of reasons. For one, a few units that had fought made no report, and for another, he had directed in mid-May that troops so lightly wounded that they could remain with their regiments were not to be listed as casualties, although such men were included in the federal tabulations. Moreover, his figure for the number captured or missing could not be reconciled with the prisoner of war records in the Adjutant General's office at Washington, which bore the names of 12,227 Confederates captured July 1st through 5th. The true total of Lee's losses in Pennsylvania could hardly have been less than 25,000, and quite possibly was far heavier. 28,063 was the figure computed by one meticulous student of such grisly matters, in which case the butcher's bill for Gettysburg, blue and gray together, exceeded 50,000 men. This was more than Shiloh and Sharpsburg combined, with Ball's Bluff and Belmont thrown in for good measure. And while there was considerably less disparity of bloodshed among the several corps of the attackers, Hill had suffered most and Ewell least, but both were within 1,000 of Longstreet, who had lost perhaps 8,500. This was by no means true of smaller units within the corps. Gordon's exultation, "The Almighty has covered my men with his shield and buckler," could scarcely have been echoed by any commander of the 8 brigades that went up Cemetery Ridge, and even within these there was a diversity of misfortune. Most regiments came back across the valley with at least a skeleton cadre to which future recruits or conscripts could be attached, but not all. The 14th Tennessee, for example, had left Clarksville in 1861 with 960 men on its muster roll, and in the past 2 years, most of which time their homeland had been under Union occupation, they had fought on all the major battlefields of Virginia. When Archer took them across Willoughby Run on the opening day of Gettysburg, they counted 365 bayonets. By sunset, they were down to barely 60. These 6 survivors, led by a captain on the 3rd day, went forward with Fry against Cemetery Ridge, and there, where the low stone wall jogged west, then south, to form what was known thereafter as the Angle, all but 3 of the remaining 60 fell. This was only one among the 40-odd regiments in the charge. There were others that suffered about as cruelly. But to those wives and sweethearts, parents and sisters and younger brothers who'd remained at its point of origin, 50 miles down the Cumberland from Nashville, the news came hard. Thus the band that was once the pride of Clarksville has fallen, a citizen lamented, and he went on to explain something of what he and those around him felt. A gloom rests over the city. The hopes and affections of the people were wrapped in the regiment. Ah, what a terrible responsibility rests upon those who inaugurated this unholy war. No one felt the responsibility harder than Lee. Though far from inaugurating, he had opposed the war at the outset, when some who were now loudest in their lamentations had called for secession or coercion, whatever the consequences, and had allowed themselves to be persuaded that all the blood that would be shed could be mopped up with a congressman's pocket handkerchief. Whereas it now turned out that at the modest rate of a quart for every dead man and a pint for each of the wounded, perhaps not all the handkerchiefs in the nation, or both nations, would suffice to soak up the blood that had been spilled at Gettysburg alone. Such macabre calculations might be of particular interest down the years, a fit subject perhaps for master's thesis when centennial time came round, but Lee's tonight were of a different nature. From the moment he saw the shattered brigades of Pickett and Pettigrew begin their stumble back across the valley, it was obvious that what was left of his army, low on food and with only enough ammunition on hand for one more day of large-scale action, would have to retreat. After riding forward to help rally the fugitives and thus present as bold a front as possible to discourage a counterattack, he went to his tent and there, by candlelight, resumed his study of the maps over which he'd pored throughout the hectic week preceding the blindfold commitment to battle. If his problems now were no less difficult, they were at least much simpler, having been reduced to the logistics of withdrawing his survivors, together with his wounded, his supply train, and his prisoners, from the immediate front of a victorious opponent deep in hostile territory. He chose his routes, decided on the order of march, and then, despite the lateness of the hour and his bone-deep weariness after 3 days of frustration, went in person to make certain that his plans were understood by the responsible commanders. By dawn, Ewell and Longstreet were to have their troops disposed along Seminary Ridge, north and south of Hill's present position in the center. All day tomorrow, whether Meade attacked or not, they were to hold their ground and thus afford a head start for the wounded as well as for the supply train and the captives, after which they were to take up the march themselves under cover of darkness, with Hill in the lead, followed by Longstreet, and Ewell bringing up the rear. Pickett's remnant, a scant 800 of his badly shaken men would be on hand at daylight, was assigned to guard the 5,000-odd Federal prisoners on the return, and Imboden's troopers would escort the miles-long column of ambulances and forage wagons loaded with such of the wounded as the surgeons judged could survive the long ride home. By this arrangement, the last infantry division to reach the field, as well as the last cavalry brigade, would be the first to depart. Before leaving his tent, Lee sent word for Imboden to report to headquarters and wait for his return, intending to give him detailed instructions for the conduct of the march. Then he went out into the night. Unlike the vague and discretionary orders he had issued throughout the week leading up to the battle, and even during the past 3 days of fighting, in the course of which his messages had been verbal and for the most part tentative, his instructions now were written and precise, allowing no discretion whatsoever to anyone at all. In Hill's case, moreover, since his was the corps that would mark the route and set the pace, Lee took the added precaution of conferring with him in person, tracing for him the line of march on the map and making certain there was no possibility of a misunderstanding. This might have waited for morning. The infantry movement would not begin until the following evening at the earliest, but evidently Lee felt that he should not, or could not, sleep until the matter had been disposed of to his satisfaction. Delegation of authority under orders had not only permitted but encouraged a wide degree of latitude in their execution by subordinates had been the basis for his greatest triumphs, particularly during the 10 months he had had Jackson to rely on. Second Manassas and Chancellorsville were instances in point. But at Gettysburg, with Stonewall just 7 weeks in his grave, the system had failed him, and his actions tonight were an acknowledgment of the fact. Though he would return to the system in time out of necessity as well as from choice, on this last night of his greatest and worst-fought battle, he abandoned it entirely. He relied on no one but himself. It was late, well after midnight, by the time he left Hill and rode back through the quiet, moonlit camps along Seminary Ridge to his headquarters beside the Chambersburg Pike. M. Bowden was waiting for him there as instructed, though no one else was stirring. His staff had gone to sleep so tired that not even a sentry had been posted. Lee drew rein and sat motionless for a time, apparently too weary to dismount. But as the cavalryman stepped forward, intending to assist him, he swung down and leaned for another long moment against Traveler, head bowed and one arm thrown across the saddle for more rest. M. Bowden watched him, awed by the tableau. The moon shone full upon his massive features and revealed an expression of sadness that I had never before seen upon his face. Then, hoping, as he said later, to change the silent current of his thoughts, ventured to speak of his obvious fatigue. "General, this has been a hard day on you." Lee raised his head, and his fellow Virginian saw grief as well as weariness in his eyes. "Yes, this has been a sad, sad day to us," he replied, emphasizing the word he'd used that afternoon in speaking to Fremantle. Again he fell silent, but presently he straightened up to his full height and spoke with more animation and excitement than M. Bowden had ever seen him display. "I never saw troops behave more magnificently than Pickett's division of Virginians did today in that grand charge upon the enemy. And if they had been supported as they were to have been, but for some reason not yet fully explained to me were not, we would have held the position and the day would have been ours." This last was a strange thing for him to say, for he himself had denied Hill permission to throw his whole corps into the assault. However, there was no mistaking the extent of his regret. Too bad, he groaned. "Oh, too bad." Suppressing his emotion, he invited M. Bowden into his tent for a study of the map and the long road home, which he was about to take. "We must now return to Virginia," he said. All next morning, having completed the perilous nighttime disengagement of both wings in order to form a continuous line of defense along Seminary Ridge, from Oak Hill on the north to the confronting loom of Round Top on the south, the Confederates awaited the answer to the question that was uppermost in their minds. Would the Federals attack? Apparently they would not. "What o'clock is it?" Longstreet finally asked an artillerist standing beside him. 11:55, the officer replied, and ventured a prediction. "General, this is the glorious 4th. We should have a salute from the other side at noon." Noon came and went, but not a gun was fired. Old Peter believed he knew why. "Their artillery was too much crippled yesterday to think of salutes," he said with satisfaction. "Meade is not in good spirits this morning." Presently there was evidence that he was wrong. Across the way in the vicinity of the peach orchard, a Union brigade was seen deploying for battle. Nothing came of this, however, for just at that time, about 1 o'clock, rain began to fall, first a drizzle, then a steady downpour. The bluecoats jammed their fixed bayonets into the ground to keep the water from running down their rifle barrels, then squatted uncomfortably beside them, shoulders hunched against the rain. Obviously, they had abandoned all notion of attack, if indeed they had had any such real intention in the first place. On their separate ridges, an average mile apart, the men of both armies peered at one another through the transparent curtain of rain as it sluiced the bloodstains from the grass and rocks where they had fought so savagely the past 3 days, but would not fight today. Lee appeared calm and confident as he watched the departure of the long column of wounded at the height of the afternoon rainstorm and continued his preparations for the withdrawal of the infantry and artillery that night. Beneath the surface, however, he was testy, as was shown by his response to a well-meant pleasantry from one of Ewell's young staff officers who came to headquarters with a report from his chief. "General," he said encouragingly, "I hope the other 2 corps are in as good condition for work as ours is this morning." Lee looked at him hard and said coldly, "What reason have you, young man, to suppose they are not?" Even before it became evident that the Federals were not going to attack, he proposed by means of a flag of truce a man-for-man exchange of prisoners, thus risking a disclosure of his intentions in hope of lightening his burden on the march. Nothing came of this. Meade prudently declined on grounds that he had no authority in such matters, and Lee continued his preparations for the withdrawal, prisoners and all. M. Bowden and the wounded were to return by way of Cashtown and Chambersburg, Greencastle and Hagerstown for a Potomac crossing near Williamsport, a distance of 40-odd miles, while the infantry would follow a route some dozen miles shorter, southwest through Fairfield to Hagerstown for a crossing at the same point, its left flank protected by units of Stuart's cavalry on the road to Emmetsburg. Though he felt confident that his opponent would be restricted in maneuver by the continuing obligation to cover Baltimore and Washington, Lee recognized the impending retrograde movement as probably the most hazardous of his career. His troops did not seem greatly dispirited by the failure of the campaign, but their weariness was apparent to even a casual eye, and a good third of those who had headed north with such high hopes a month ago would not be returning. Including the walking wounded who remained with their commands, he had fewer than 50,000 effectives of all arms. Moreover, Meade by now must have received heavy reinforcements from the surrounding northern states as well as from his nearby capital, whereas Lee could expect no such transfusions of strength until he crossed the Potomac, if at all.